A welcome sight for the people of Caracas. Trucks full of food, medicine, and other essentials arrive in the capital. It's the third batch of supplies to enter Venezuela since President Nicolas Maduro lifted a ban on international aid.
The Red Cross received 2 prior shipments which were used to reach 14 states. With this shipment, we'll be able to extend our operations to the rest of the country.
But whatever relief they provide may be short-lived. The US has imposed a complete embargo on all of Venezuela's international assets and transactions.
All property and interest in property of the government of Venezuela that are in the United States, that hereafter come within the United States, or that are or hereafter come within the possession or control of any United States person, are blocked and may not be transferred, paid, exported, withdrawn, or otherwise dealt in.
The once wealthy oil exporter is already struggling under sanctions on government officials, banks, and the state-run oil company PDVSA. The United Nations says 25% of the population needs humanitarian assistance. Nearly 2 million people are suffering from malnutrition, and the lives of 300,000 patients are at risk because of a lack of medicines. Despite the economic pressure and political isolation, President Maduro remains defiant.
¿Por qué él anuncia esto?
All of Venezuela, in a civil-military union, rejects the statements of Donald Trump about a supposed quarantine of a supposed blockade. I say to Donald Trump, you are an imperialist criminal. You can't do that to Venezuela.
He's counting on support from Russia, China, and other nations that oppose regime change. But 30 countries, including many of Venezuela's neighbors, have joined a US-led initiative for a peaceful transfer of power. And as the political deadlock persists, so do the troubles of millions of Venezuelans. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
Well, let's get more on this now with Carlos de Sousa in Zurich. He's lead economist at Oxford Economics. Welcome back to the program, Carlos. Now, you've been following the crisis in Venezuela for some time now. What impact will this new US embargo have on the country?
Hi, Oscar. Thank you for having me. We think the most important part of this new measures that were announced yesterday was the freeze of assets by the government in the United States. When it is reported there is a full embargo on Venezuela, the embargo applies to the Venezuelan government, to the Venezuelan regime, and not to all of Venezuela. Like, the private sector can still deal with transactions with the United States, the Venezuelan private sector. And moreover, even the government of Venezuela can import food and medicine from the United States, so they just cannot import other stuff other than food and medicine. So it is not what I would call a total embargo. I think the most important sanctions were imposed back at the end of January, and those were the oil sanctions. Those were very, very severe sanctions, and we estimate that the economy this year will contract about 36%. And a big part of that contraction is because of the oil sanctions, but not because of the sanctions that were announced yesterday. We think that the ones announced yesterday are just an incremental measure. And the reason I say it's very important that they block the assets of the Venezuelan government in the United States is because then creditors of the state oil company PDVSA cannot seize assets from PDVSA in the United States if they're not paid. And that has important consequences, at least for bondholders, but not necessarily for the Venezuelan economy.
Okay, and as you say, this is just another step towards increasing US sanctions on Venezuela. But what is the Trump administration hoping to achieve?
What they're trying to achieve is two-pronged. So on the one hand, they're trying to avoid the Venezuelan regime continue to plunder the riches of Venezuela and to benefit from the crisis in a way, and to use their frontmen in the United States for money laundering purposes. So that's one part of the measures taken yesterday. The other part is that now that Citgo is in control of the opposition government in Venezuela, the interim government of Juan Guaido, and not of the President Maduro, then obviously President Maduro doesn't have an incentive to pay the only Venezuelan bond that is not defaulted yet. That's the PDVSA 2020. Back in April, the opposition paid an interest payment on this bond, but in October, they will have to pay $900 million to avoid losing Citgo, which is a very large complex of refineries owned by Venezuela in the United States. Now that Trump has frozen all the Venezuelan assets in the United States, the opposition can now have peace of mind that they can default on the bond and use that money for other purposes, like, for example, importing food and medicine, and then they will not lose this key strategic asset for the country, which are these refineries in the United States. For me, that's the most important part of the measures taken yesterday.
Okay, now at what point do you think will Nicolas Maduro actually be swayed by these sanctions? When will they significantly impact him, do you think?
It is difficult that through sanctions alone, they will convince Nicolas Maduro to leave power. I honestly don't think this is the most effective way of doing it. And it could take many years, to be honest, if this is the only thing that the United States is going to do to support the Venezuelan opposition. I think the hope of many is that as the collapse continues, more people within the regime will be discontent with the current state of affairs and will want to have a change to remove the president. I think that's the hope. It is not clear when that will happen or whether it will happen at all. We think that the Venezuelan government most likely there will have to be some change, at least in the president, if not in the entire government, in the next 2 or 3 years. But it's not something we're expecting imminently to happen. No. We think there will be no change, at least for the next year.
Okay, Carlos de Sousa, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you again for your time.